Hello and welcome into the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports, and we're doing this on a little bit of a Wednesday afternoon, not our normal Sunday. It's been a crazy with the holiday season. I really am just now getting back into knowing what day of the week it is after signing day and the bowl game, Christmas, New Year's. It's been pretty crazy, but we are joined by Kevin Flaherty today. We're going to talk about the Liberty Bowl for a little bit, but then maybe focus a little bit more on big picture, kind of year two of the Lance Leipold era thoughts. But Kevin, I know you were in Memphis. I know it's been a bit of a wild holiday festivity period for you, just like it was for me. But how have you been doing lately, my friend?
Doing well, doing well. Overcoming a little sickness, so I apologize if I'm coming off a little raw or whatever. But no, doing well. That was a wild bowl trip, was it not?
It was, and I gotta see what side this is. I'm rocking my media issued Liberty Bowl hat for the
There you go.
occasion. It was crazy. It was crazy. Everything about the game, start to finish. And I think I wrote this in my post game story, but it really encapsulated everything about Kansas' season. Right?
Yep.
There were diabolical mistakes early on, and things compounded. But at the end of the day, Jalen Daniels stood out, and KU showed its resiliency. And I think it was just everything about the second half there was just you kept kind of looking back and being like, is this really happening? Did that play just happen? Is this call going Kansas way? Or are things really going to go to overtime? And for me, I watched all of overtime and the last drive of the game from the sideline because I was already on my way headed down to the media room being like, all right, I got to get ready for press conferences and get video ready. And then all of a sudden things really changed as I was on my way down. So I'm like, great, well, I'm already down here. Let's head to the field. And it was a pretty cool atmosphere to see where a lot of the Kansas fans were making noise. Obviously, the Arkansas side of the stadium was making noise too. But I mean, Kevin, for you in the stadium, like, what was that experience like getting to watch that game firsthand from a fan's perspective?
Yeah, I think the Liberty Bowl made a great choice with Kansas and Arkansas. Not necessarily from a game standpoint, although obviously it wound up being an instant classic.
Yeah.
But I think from an atmosphere standpoint, both Kansas fans and Arkansas fans turned up in huge numbers, and they were both turned pretty up, and so there were times when Arkansas was dominating the game where that side of the stadium was pretty loud, and you had a pretty somber atmosphere over on the Kansas side, and then Kansas starts making its comeback, and it's everybody's kind of they're excited, but you're still like, there's no way this can happen, right? You still got to get the onside kick. You've been lucky just to get to this point, and then you get the onside kick, and people are jumping into the arms of people they don't even know, and I was trying to explain it to one of our colleagues, Joey Helmer, who writes for the OU site, and Joey was actually up here at Power and Light when the Royals won the World Series. And I know that sounds crazy for people to hear that, but like the moment when they recovered the onside kick and they go down, score the touchdown, get the 2-point conversion, that was like that. Like just sheer pandemonium. It didn't matter who was next to you, if you knew him or you didn't know him. People were hugging, were jumping around, running up and down the aisles. I mean, it was just sheer, I described it as pandemonium, and that's exactly what it was. What was it like on the sidelines for all of that?
It was pretty crazy because I think a lot of other maybe media members had the same idea as I did, where the sideline got pretty flooded. And the fact that they changed end zones for me, I was like, oh gosh, it was just a madhouse of people trying to rush from one end zone to the other and back to the other one. And that was wild, but it was really cool to see, honestly. I think you maybe get a different perspective on some of these games, and it's a little bit harder to see some of the plays unfold, but I think you get a good perspective of just the sheer size and athletic ability of some of these players, and the pads were popping. I'll tell you
Yeah.
that much. The pads were popping. It was loud when you heard guys get hit. Like I think Kai Thomas, there's one of the runs, I think maybe the third overtime, first or third overtime when he got hit. And I was like, ouch. That sounded like that did not feel good at all. So it was a cool experience to see it that way. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the more big picture stuff in a second, but let's get to Jalen Daniels. I mean, just an incredible performance. Over 550 yards passing, a Kansas record, a Liberty Bowl record. I mean, a historic performance for a quarterback that I think is probably the perfect cherry on top, I'll say, for what was a really good season. And it makes you wonder, hey, maybe what would have happened here if Daniels didn't get hurt. Obviously, he wasn't great against Iowa State and wasn't great in the first half against TCU, but
Sure.
I think over the course of a full season, I think you would have seen that, hey, Jalen maybe isn't a Heisman caliber quarterback, but also isn't what he showed in those two games. And I think he showed at the ceiling of what he can be in that Arkansas game because they couldn't run the ball. Kansas could not run the ball. They needed Jalen Daniels to do stuff. And man, oh man, did he ever.
Yeah, and I thought, it's so interesting you bring up the TCU game. We've talked about this in the past where I felt like things were opening up for them in the end of that first half in the TCU game.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Jalen has the mistake where he fumbles the ball at the goal line where they could have had points. But I felt like they were starting to move. They realized that, hey, on the option stuff, that they were still really running heavy at that point. TCU was, if they had one guy there, that guy was gunning for Jalen. He was going to leave the pitch back to make sure that Jalen didn't hurt him. And I felt like it took him a little bit of time to adjust. And the reason I say that's interesting is I felt very similar against Arkansas. Like there was an adjustment or a feeling out period for Jalen in the offense. You get down 24-7, and all of those things. But, then all of a sudden you started to see them move the ball, get a little bit more comfortable. And then, man, it came like a tidal wave. And I think, you and I have talked about this sequence, but one of the things that stood out, Kansas got so many plays from so many different guys on that offense. And as a Chiefs guy myself, you see that with a guy like Patrick Mahomes. And I'm not saying that Jalen is Patrick Mahomes, but I'm saying one of the things that you notice about Patrick Mahomes is whether it's, Watson or Sky Moore or whoever, they can rotate guys through and he's still going to get plays out of these guys that maybe aren't as high up on the depth chart. And the sequence that stood out to me, and I know we've talked about it, is you're in 2nd and 29, your receivers are exhausted. You had Kevin Terry for 30 yards, and then you had Douglas Emillion on the very next play for the touchdown. To me, as much as anything that he did, and he had some passes that I think you go back and watch, and you kind of tilt your head and say, man, that was a ball and a half. But I think that sequence really stood out for me in terms of the way that he was able to elevate guys that maybe aren't your traditional playmakers for this offense. What did you think?
Yeah, and I think it's just the saying that I think we've said several times this year. It's the rising tide lifts all boats, and that's what Jalen Daniels is for this offense. And I just don't think that if you have another quarterback back there that isn't as mobile as Jalen, doesn't have the arm talent of Jalen, he doesn't throw for 550 plus yards, right? Like how many times do you see Daniels extend plays with his legs and then flash the arm talent? It's just the things that make him such a special quarterback and why it's so crucial that he'll be at KU next season. I left that game thinking, wow, like another full off season for him to, again, really, really take another step forward, allow these wide receivers to continue to develop, because I think that was something that you saw over the course of this season. Going into the season, you're wondering, all right, Quentin Skinner, if he's your starter, like, what does that mean? Well, he showed that, okay, he's a big-time deep play threat. You knew that Luke Grimm is a guy that's been really consistent in his college career. And before he got banged up halfway through the season, he was really consistent. And then the guy that I think week 1 to week 13 was the most consistent out of them all was Lawrence Arnold. Even if he's not getting a ton of receptions each week, what he does blocking, what he does in terms of just being a possession receiver who can get big third down catches or big catches, along the sideline. I just think overall another off season for this offense is huge. And let's get to the defense before we talk big picture offense. Let's transition there first. Obviously, the first half looked like a Kansas defense in the second half of the season. I think they really struggled with Arkansas up front. Those offensive linemen were huge. And even if they're down their starting center, their backup guy was still a highly regarded recruit who is huge. And so I think early on, Arkansas had so much success running up the middle. And then on that first drive, they made the weird decision to all of a sudden try and go to the outside. And that's where KU, I think, has the athleticism to at least close that down with guys like Craig Young, Kobe Bryant, Melo Dotson, right? Make what you want about them, their ability to tackle, they can close space. And I just thought they struggled so much going against the run. And man, KJ Jefferson, he's someone that you watch him on TV and you see his size, and then you go watch him warm up in person, and he looks an inch taller and 15 pounds heavier.
Yeah.
He's a unit. Like, he's bigger than Jalen Daniels, size-wise, height-wise. Like, he's a unit. I think Kansas really struggled with that. And then the second half, they played the run a lot better. I thought the defensive line, I thought Lonnie Phelps had a really good game before he had to leave with cramps. The defensive tackles, those veterans, in addition to Tommy Dunn, played really well. And then in the second half, you have a string of, I think it was 6 or 7 drives in a row where they get stops. Kevin, comment on the defense, and then I've got a really interesting anecdote for you.
Yeah, I think, early on, you hold to a field goal, which I think is somewhat of a victory.
Mm-hmm.
You force a punt on their second drive, and you have a chance to go down and make it 14-3. And the offense makes a mistake. They have a missed mesh point, I guess you would say, sort of a botched handoff that sets them behind the chains. They have to punt it. Arkansas goes down and scores. You say, okay, it's 10-7. You mess up the ensuing kickoff. Arkansas gets the ball back. And so I thought the defense, even though it started okay, I thought they were really put on their back foot in a hurry. And I think that, this is maybe not going to be the most popular thing to say. I thought one of the heroes of the game for Kansas was maybe Sam Pittman, and the way that he took his foot off the gas in the second half. And, you go back and you rewatch, and Arkansas was trying to run out the clock in the third quarter. I mean, they took their foot off the gas, and I think, yes, you notice that, but the other part is you still got to get stops. And I thought the defense made some good, negative plays. Jeremy Robinson made a couple really nice negative plays, and I think that it was one of those things where the offense obviously is going to get the headlines when your quarterback throws for 550 yards and you put up all those points. And obviously Arkansas was able to turn the offense back on in the overtime. But at the same time, I really felt like this was one of those games where Kansas's defense was kind of what gave them the chance in the end.
It did. And right, you have to get the stops to keep your team in the game. It doesn't matter how vanilla Arkansas went or how conservative. You mentioned, you being a Chiefs fan. Well, it reminded me a lot of like vintage Andy Reid when he was with the Eagles, right? Where it's, okay, we've got enough points. Just let's see the game out. And I thought that KU's defense did a good job of honing in on it. Kevin, I was able to watch back some of the broadcast, and I'm a little disappointed they didn't show any of this. The Kansas sideline was something else during the second half. I think there was maybe that push out of bounds from Kenny Logan where I think he was flagged 15 yards for it. Kenny is someone that, wears his heart on his sleeve, emotional leader, guy that I think a lot of the defense credits as being one of those guys that gets everyone hyped up and like that. He was frustrated, and he went back to the bench and just sat down. I think it was right before O.J. Burrows got the pick. Yes, it was. And he was seated on the bench. Like, he wasn't even standing up on the sideline. Like, he was away taking a moment to himself, like trying to refocus. And the interception happens, and he's just sitting there. Well, then in the second half, right, as KU's defense is stringing together these stops, you see Craig Young go over to the offense and start laying into guys where he's like clearly saying stuff to the offense.
Yep.
And the guys were seated on the bench, and some of the kind of the reserves on offense kind of ushered him away. And that was the stretch where I think KU had forced maybe its third straight stop or second straight stop. And then the offense just came and went 3 and out. And I think it just shows that the competitive side of this team, where even if at that point they were still down 2, it may have been 3 scores, these guys are still out there competing. And I think you can say, oh, is this a problem? I don't think it's a problem. I think it shows how competitive these guys are. And I think it's a huge step forward where how many times in past years, have you watched a Kansas game, Kevin, you in person, or, me just watching in the press box, where KU gets down and all of a sudden the heads are down on the sideline. There's not a bunch of guys trying to fire each other up. I just thought it was really interesting. And I think it points to the culture. And that's something that for me, I think is my biggest takeaway from this game is, you can lose your quarterback year to year. You can lose your defensive line year to year. The culture stays though. And I think that for me is the most encouraging part is as these results in the second half of the season have not gone Kansas's way, the effort and the fight and the resiliency has not gone anywhere. Outside of the Texas game that I thought was just demoralizing overall,
Yeah.
I think the team has been resilient and they fought. And I think those are the type of things that really carry over to season. And even if the on-field results aren't there, those are the type of things that really have an impact when you're talking about January, February, March, all the way through August. So that for me was my biggest takeaway. And I think Craig Young's ability to, or not ability, but want to lay into the offense for not doing their jobs. And I'm sure the offense probably felt the same way about the defense early in the game. Granted, as you mentioned, interceptions and fumbling a kickoff don't help. But I think for me, that was my biggest takeaway just from the game. And also, I think just maybe even the final 7 games of the season. This team fights, and that's something that definitely can carry over year to year.
Yeah, you look at the Baylor game, and it was very similar in terms of you're missing Jalen Daniels, Daniel Highshot. People forget now because Devin Neal had a great year. When Highshot went down, he was leading this team in rushing. I believe Luke Grimm didn't play in that game too. So you're without, at that point, your leading guy in receptions, your guy who was your leading rusher, and your starting quarterback and star quarterback in Jalen Daniels, and they're just getting clobbered in that game. I mean, they had no business being in that game, but they forced some turnovers on defense. They did a couple things, and next thing you know, it's like 28-23 in the fourth quarter, and you're looking at it, and Baylor had to be looking around on the sidelines like, why aren't these guys dead? But it was very similar, I thought, and I think one of the really encouraging things is I think a lot of that fight comes from the offseason program with Gildersleeve. I think he's a tremendous strength coach, and hopefully he'll start getting his due from more of a national point of view, because you look at these, Kansas led the Big 12 in returning starters this year, and these are guys that were on last year's team that only won 2 games. And all of a sudden they're putting themselves in a position where if they had been healthy, maybe they win 8. And, with the same group of guys and a different mentality and all of those different things. The other thing I'll say that's one of my main takeaways from this season, I love the way, and we've talked about it week after week after week, I loved Lance Leipold repeatedly pushing away moral victories. And we saw that against TCU in a game where College Game Day was there. You played a team that is now in the national title game and had every chance to win that game. And Lance Leipold's comments were, we needed to play a little cleaner to win. We needed to not make the mistake at the goal line. We needed to do this and that. We needed to connect on this pass or not commit that penalty. And, you came out of that thinking, well, okay, that's a good message. But you heard it over and over, even when the fight was good, like you were saying, even against Arkansas, he comes out and he's like, well, it didn't help that we got behind 24-7, making our own mistakes. And I think that's one of the encouraging things looking forward. And it's kind of interesting, not to get off topic, but I saw a K-State fan say this about Jerome Tang last night, was they won at Texas, and Jerome Tang was basically like, well, we got to get better. And that, and that's an encouraging sign, I feel like, when you're letting your players get excited for the moment, but at the same time, you're saying, look, this isn't our goal. We want to be better than this. And I thought that Lance Leipold and the staff, the way that they continually drilled that in, a near miss against a really good team, even a team in Arkansas that, like you said, they were bigger and more athletic than Kansas was. Arkansas was probably a better football team like when you just went and looked at all the different parts. And KU hangs around and goes into triple overtime and
Mhm.
everything. And Kansas came out basically saying, if we're going to win a game against a team like Arkansas, we got to play better. And I think that's an encouraging sign for the future too.
Exactly. And I think it contributes to probably the feeling inside the program that, hey, any given week, we can go compete with anybody, especially
Yep.
in the Big 12, right? You think about the new schedule coming out, and it seems like either Kansas is going to play Texas or Oklahoma, not have to play both, and they'll most likely play one or two of the new Big 12 schools in addition to that. Um, I think that contributes to the overall belief of, hey, if Jalen Daniels doesn't throw 2 first-half interceptions, if Sevion Morrison doesn't fumble that kickoff, maybe we're talking about a bit of a different game. Granted,
Yep.
Arkansas probably still wins because maybe they don't take their foot off the gas and they continue to run down KU's throat for 4 quarters. You can't really play this second
Sure.
hand game of, oh, if this happens, this happens. But what I can say is that a game like this will help contribute to that. And so I think as I take a step back for KU offensively, it's pretty exciting to look to next year, right? You return 10 of 11 starters for most of the season. You're going to lose Earl Bostic, your starting left tackle, but Logan Brown, the transfer from Wisconsin, is going to come in and most likely be your starter. And
Yep.
he's a guy that Earl Bostic was a very good player. Logan Brown is bigger and has a higher ceiling than Earl Bostic. And again, that's nothing against Earl Bostic, who's a really good starter for Kansas. Um, that's an area where I think Kansas is set to take a step forward. The coaching staff has really made wide receiver a priority in the transfer portal. It's something I asked Andy Kotelnicki about on national or before National Signing Day, basically being like, "Hey, like you guys are going after all these wide receivers, and yet you're basically going to return all of them that played." And what he said was, "Hey, we were down one scholarship this season at the wide receiver position. We want to fill that scholarship, but we also want a speedy guy who can be dynamic with the ball in their hands."
Yep.
And I think that's exactly what we've talked about at times this season, Kevin, that
Yep.
Kansas has missed, right? You've got a guy in Luke Grimm who can get open on third down. You've got a 50-50 possession receiver in Lawrence Arnold. You got a deep play threat in Quentin Skinner. But who's the guy that you throw to on a hitch 5 yards and he can take it 30 or take it 50? They really don't have that guy right now. And so I
Yep.
think it's an area of growth for Kansas. You look at the running back room, Devin Neal, Daniel Highshar both can return. Kai Thomas entered the transfer portal, or said he's going to enter as of 1:30. On Wednesday as we record this, he hasn't, but he will. You're going to lose him, but he didn't really do a whole lot this season. And so you're going to turn most of your production there. Tight end, same deal. And so overall, I think this is an offense that with another year in the program, and if they are able to add that wide receiver they're looking for, I think it's an offense that can be able to maybe be more consistent, because I think at times this season was a lot of hot and cold, right? 4
Yep.
drives of straight touchdowns and then 6 drives of punts and turnovers. Can they be more consistent? They're not going to score a touchdown on every drive, but can you maintain possession, not have 3 and outs? Can you give that defense a rest? I think for me, when you look at the gaps and filling in the margins, I think that's kind of the next step for this offense. Can they be more consistent throughout the game? They could still score the same amount of points next season, right? 35 plus per game. You take that, but can they help out the defense more? I think is now maybe the
Yeah.
next step for the offense.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And the other thing too is, Devin Neal, with him being hurt for the latter part of the year, Kansas certainly would have loved to have him at full speed against Kansas State. That could have been a big deal there. Kansas didn't run the ball well against Arkansas. Kansas really struggled up front, and you would hope that the addition of another year in the weight room, another year's development, and adding in Logan Brown, maybe Kansas is in a better position next year to where the other team says, hey, we know you want to run the ball. We're going to put guys in the box, and Kansas is able to run the ball anyway. And I think that, that's a potential advantage. I thought you hit the nail right on the head on the wide receiver position. We've talked about it on the show, and I was so encouraged to read that in your article, talking to Kotelnicki, where he said, hey, we want to go out and get this yard after catch guy who's got speed that can create chunk plays out of safe plays, because I think that that's really what they're missing on that offense right now is somebody who can take a relatively easy pass and do something with it. make a guy miss, outrun the defense, do something with it. And so I think that's encouraging as well. Tight end position looks really good, obviously, as well. And I thought too, I realize he's going to be a freshman, but running backs, they have a tendency to play early.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Johnny Thompson is a guy who maybe brings a little bit more of an explosive element to this offense as well as a running back, given that, Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw, Neal's got a little more juice, Highshaw's got a little more power, but they're both, a little bit bigger backs. I think Thompson could maybe give them a little bit of a different element in that backfield as well, that where maybe he gets a chance to get some of those Kai Thomas touches and carries as well.
Yeah, I agree. I wrote about it for our VIP members when Johnny Thompson committed, where I'm like, I see the perfect running back for Kansas. He
Yep.
has the explosiveness to be a one cut and go guy with the ball in his hands if you're doing the outside zone stuff, but he's someone you can throw the ball to in the flat and be pretty good. And I think Devin Neal's a really good player, and I think he's a really good running back, but catching the ball in the flat is not necessarily one of his biggest strengths. And I think Daniel Highshaw, physically really good. He can catch the ball out of the flat, but maybe he doesn't have as much wiggle in that type of situation. I think that's what maybe Johnny Thompson could bring. Not saying he's going to play a bunch, but, if you're talking about guys who grow over the course of the season, right? If you're saying, hey, next November, Johnny Thompson gets, 3-4 touches against whoever, I'd say, yeah, I would believe that. But I think for me, the biggest step forward holistically as a team, as a program for Kansas, has to come in the trenches, because I think you look at the games that Kansas really struggled in. You think about Oklahoma, Texas, Baylor, Arkansas, even Kansas State to some degree. All of those teams are bigger, stronger than Kansas in the trenches, and it showed. And I think for me, I look at this Arkansas game, walking around on the sideline pregame, like you go walk by Kansas offensive line and defensive line, as everyone's warming up, and then you go over to the other side and go walk by Arkansas, like it's 2 inches and 15 pounds is what it is. Not saying Kansas has to recruit SEC defensive linemen or offensive linemen. No. Not saying that. But in order to take a step forward in the Big 12, they just got to get bigger and stronger in the trenches. And a year under Matt Gildersleeve will help a lot of those guys do that. But I think it also has to be helped in recruiting. And I think that's what you're seeing now. Again, as we record on Wednesday afternoon, there are transfers on their way to Kansas that Kansas is interested in. That probably would help in the trenches. And I think for me, that's the biggest area. And I think you look defensively now, if we're going to transition there, Kansas did this year where first basically 5 weeks of the season, they're holding opponents to 3.3 yards a carry. And then in the second half of the season, that really, expanded to about 6. I want to say I haven't looked at the final postseason numbers, but it was about that. And I think what you saw is Kansas up front has some players who can hold their own. But I think holistically, you need to get more athletic. And I think the whole front seven needs to get more athletic. And that's not something that can happen in the course of one offseason. I think the defensive line and Jim Panagos, the defensive tackles coach, have done that. You look at Gage Keys coming in from Minnesota, his athletic testing numbers at defensive tackle would have been in the top tier of the NFL draft. Granted, he's 20 pounds lighter than a lot of those guys, but the athletic ability is there. You look at Devin Phillips coming from Colorado State, someone that had a lot of production when he played a lot during the 2021 season. I think those are two guys that are probably early favorites to start next year. Kevin, you and I have talked on the VIP board about Austin Booker and our conversations about him before we really even knew how hard Kansas was pushing for him. Well, he's a supreme athlete, and he's someone that is going to be probably the best athlete in the front seven. And he's going to play defensive line or kind of weak side defensive end, most likely. So I think you're starting to see that transition to the 4-man front. Now, I think linebacker is kind of the next area, right? Craig Young, A-plus athlete, can play for anyone in the Big 12. But, Rich Miller, we know what he is. He's pretty good against the run, kind of struggles in space against coverage. Same thing with Talon Berryhill. Pretty good on blitzes, can do a good job there, but still has his limitations. And so for me, I look at the defensive improvement, and I think so much can be helped in terms of the secondary by really improving the overall athleticism of the front seven.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and for those who aren't on the VIP board, it was kind of funny. Gage Keys had gotten an offer from Kansas. And so, Michael and I, being the Twitter weirdos that we are, I went and looked at his profile, and I saw that he had retweeted a teammate's tape and said, basically anybody looking for two really good linemen or something. And so I flipped on Austin Booker's tape, and I let Swain know, and we had no idea at that point if KU was even going to look at Booker. Like it wasn't out there yet that Kansas had that interest. And I go, who Kansas really should go after is Gage Keys' teammate. And I think, your points on Keys were really well put, and that I think that Kansas had some guys who could hold up at the point of attack pretty well at defensive tackle, but I don't think that they had that three technique who could shoot a gap and really create a lot of issues. That's who Gage Keys is. And right now he's probably 280 pounds. You expect Gildersleeve to get that up, a little bit. I think you wrote that, Kansas thinks they can get him to around 290 by the time the season starts. 6'5", 290 and can move. That's different than what Kansas has on that defensive line, for the most part. And you're starting to see a little bit more of it with guys like Tommy Dunn and DJ Withers moving in, who are a little bit more athletic, I feel like, than the guys that were there before. You add Booker, who's 6'6", is really explosive, as a guy that could be opposite Lonnie Phelps potentially. You look at some of the guys that they brought in to develop a year ago, in Davion Westmoreland. I think Dean Miller is still there, guys that Kansas didn't think was going to be, they didn't think they were going to be guys this year, but they brought them in and said, hey, we're going to get these guys into our program, let them learn the culture, let them learn the weight room. Jeremy Robinson's coming back. Maybe one of those other guys develops along with that, and you get so much more athletic along the front end. And I think you were so apt in saying that's the biggest part affecting the secondary. I feel like is, not necessarily that Kansas couldn't get better in the secondary, because of course it could, but the flip side of that is if you have a defensive line that's consistently generating pressure, that's consistently occupying blocks, I think that secondary would look quite a bit better almost immediately. And obviously Kansas is looking in the portal to add, another defensive back potentially in there, get a little bit more athletic at linebacker. But the single biggest thing defensively that they could do to help those guys out is to become more athletic and just flat better on the front end.
Yeah, I agree. And in terms of the secondary, right, Kobe Bryant probably going to return, Mello Dotson, Kalen Gervin, you're going to return your guys. And I think that at the end of the day, you know what these guys are at this point.
Pretty good group of safeties. Obviously Kenny Logan coming back. OJ Burroughs had some really good moments. I thought Marvin Grant, from where he was at the start of the year to where he was at the end of the year, I thought there was a pretty major shift there. And I know I'm not saying that they're going to play a ton next year, but I know you and I liked some of the younger guys in there too, like Caleb Purdy, Mason Ellis, guys who are probably going to help you in special teams next year and help you get more athletic on special teams, but also players that, could maybe get the odd rep here and there as Kansas starts preparing their next group of guys. The way that you get better isn't necessarily by just going out and getting one really good guy. It's by stacking talent. And when you stack talent, some of those guys are going to pan out. It's not going to be everybody. It's not always going to be who you expect it to be. I think this is off the top of my head, but I think that within his recruiting class, I think Kansas actually landed a higher rated defensive back than Aqib Talib. So it's not always who you think it's going to be, but the way that you find success is basically by getting a lot of bites at the apple. And I think that that's something that they're working on and doing a lot better job of.
Exactly. I think for me, the guy at safety I'm going to watch is Jalen Dye, the JUCO transfer. I think he's someone that might be a special teams guy next year, get some reps there, obviously return. I'd like to see Marvin Grant get more snaps, honestly. I think he showed a lot of strides, like you mentioned, over the course of the season. And I think just at cornerback, it's like, can you just get another guy that is better than what you have? I think Kobe Bryant's fine. He's someone that makes big plays, which you need in terms of momentum swinging plays. But I think down to down consistency, KU just needs to get better at cornerback. And that's something Jordan Peterson talked about going into the season was, hey, consistency is what we need to see from the corners. And I think at times you saw flashes of it, and maybe another year of development will help those guys. But I think just getting another guy in there that you can trust would be big. And so I think for me overall, the trenches are just the biggest step forward where Kansas can take. I think athletically, defensively, Kansas can do that. And I think you get Kenny Logan back, great, a leader. I don't think he had a really good season. That's just my opinion, watching the games, and I think he was fine. But still having a leader back like that, guy that can set the tone, a guy that, again, can keep everyone in the right spots, I think that's huge. And so I think defensively, even if you don't see a huge overhaul in terms of personnel, I think what you said right there is right. This is the time now when Kansas player development has to come in handy. And thankfully, I think for KU as a program, that's where this coaching staff has kind of made their money over the years, right?
Yep.
They have been guys that get, whatever you want to say, like an 80, 85 rated player. And by the time they leave, they're like a 90 rated player, if you want to go by like Madden terms, right? They get better. And so I think another offseason of development will help a lot of these guys. I think you even think about the growth of someone like Tywone Berryhill or OJ Burrows from, last year to the end of this year, right? They all got a lot better. And now you can think about extrapolating that over the course of another year. And I think that's where maybe you can see some of that margin come to a close for Kansas. And I think defensive tackle is fascinating just because you lose so many guys.
Sure.
I think right now, I mentioned Phillips and Keys, and, you mentioned DJ Withers and Tommy Dunn. I think those are the first four right now for next year. And
Yep.
we'll see who the fifth guy is. But I just think overall defensively, this now is when the continuity really starts to kick in, and when the player development has to start to kick in for, I think, Kansas to make some strides defensively, which it has to happen.
Yep.
Kansas has to get better defensively next year, and I think it will happen, but it's going to come because this coaching staff is able to develop players. So, Kevin, for you then, what's the big storyline you're watching, between now and, let's say, the start of spring ball? What are you looking for?
Well, I wanted to say just real quick on the
Yeah.
other thing too. We've talked so much about you want to play somebody because they're good and they're ready, not because you have to play them.
True.
And when you look at, a guy like, let's say, Jameel Croft, who I was super high on coming out of high school, maybe 2 years ago, that guy has thrown, like Prunty, into the fire right away because he's a really talented athlete. Now, Kansas, you bring in maybe another transfer at that cornerback spot. He's allowed to develop. And hey, if he's one of your best two guys, that's not necessarily a bad thing because those guys have played the guys in front of him. And so if he's playing, he's really good. It's not necessarily that, hey, you just need a body out there and he's the best what you have. It's funny you were asking about a storyline, and I actually wanted to ask you a question, and it'll kind of be along my lines. So you covered Iowa State, and as I always say every week when I bring up another team, this is not an Iowa State podcast. You covered Iowa State when Iowa State had the breakout year and went to the Big 12 title game. And the next year, they brought back a lot of guys, and there were expectations, and people said, well, if they were this good this year, they're going to be even better this year. And people were picking them, as a dark horse college football playoff candidate and all these different things. Obviously, Kansas is not going to have that level of expectation. But I think what you are going to see is a lot of opposing fans across the Big 12 trying to link Kansas with that Iowa State thing and saying, no. Last time we had a team that we thought was really good, returned a lot of guys. Of course, they were going to be better because they returned so many guys. They didn't reach expectations. So I guess my question for you is, why did that Iowa State team fall short, do you think? And why do you think there's a chance that Kansas maybe will be different next year?
Well, I think you have to throw Baylor into that mix too, right?
Sure.
They win the Big 12 and return a lot of guys, and then all of a sudden it's like, actually, are they really that good? I think
Yeah.
for Iowa State, it came down to a mixture of injuries and a conservative approach. Brees Hall got hurt in fall camp,
Yeah.
and he didn't look like himself until halfway through the season. And all of a sudden, if you don't have your dynamic first round pick running back, I know he wasn't a first round pick, but I think everyone knows he should have been.
Yeah. Sure.
He's going to be the rookie of the year of the NFL if he stayed healthy. Like, that's how good he was. So if you don't have him healthy, that impacts a lot of things. And as a result, I think Matt Campbell and Tom Manning just got real scared. And they didn't let Brock Purdy, San Francisco 49er legend Brock Purdy, I should say, didn't let him do his thing. And so I think as a result, things kind of compounded. And I think the defense got really banged up. Those linebackers that were so great in that 2020 season were really hurt in 2021. And I think that had an impact. So I think for Kansas, it's now about, hey, the depth. Can you really try and maintain that? And I mentioned linebacker. That for me is kind of one of my storylines I'm watching for. It's like, who the heck is going to step up at linebacker? Because you lost Jared Gilliard and you lose Lorenzo McCaskill and, whatever about Gavin Potter, but you basically lose your three guys that were the backups. And so, Jason Gilliam is playing Hawk behind Craig Young, or at least he was during the pre-bowl practices. And then it's a question of, all right, well, who are kind of your backups behind Rich Miller and Tywin Berryhill? That's why KU's going to the portal to go try and find another linebacker. But I think for KU, it's now about, okay, the depth, and can you stick to your identity? And I think that's the nice part about having Andy Kotelnicki as your offensive coordinator. He's going to continue to be creative. I think that was the issue with Iowa State that year, is that they kind of just tried to be who they were the year before and didn't really try and evolve. I think Andy Kotelnicki is going to try and evolve and not say, oh, this is who we were last year, so this is who we're going to be this year. Like, that's I think he'd laugh at you if I tried to say, yeah, you're going to be the same next year. You'd be like, no, we'll change and we'll evolve and we'll adapt. And I think that's the thing. And just stay healthy, right? You can't control health to some degree, but, can you stay healthy? Because that, I think, is one of the biggest things in football. Like, look at TCU, for example, right? They had a bunch of injuries early in the season. They get healthy, and all of a sudden they're in the national title game. Like, if Quentin Johnson gets hurt at the end of the season instead of the beginning of the season, they're not where they are right now. And so I think you got to get some luck with injuries too.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, the other storyline for me is, you've had some success.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that success? Yeah. Is going to a bowl game and being known as the team that got Kansas back after 14 years, is that good enough for you? Or, when you're running your 100-meter sprints that you have to run, on a blazing hot Kansas day, is it a situation where you're on your last sprint and you put everything into that because you're saying, no, that wasn't good enough? Do you remain the hunter rather than the hunted? And I know that all of those are cliches or whatever else, but I think that this is a Kansas team that, even with the additions, they're not going to be the most talented team in the Big 12. And they're probably not going to be a top 5 most talented team in the Big 12. And so what they need to do is they need to operate with poise. They need to operate with polish. And they need to be the team that sets the tone. And I think that that's kind of what I'm watching heading into spring practice. And I think you can tell some of that from spring practice is just, hey, how's the team adjusting to this? Is it something where they feel like they've already made it? Or is it this sort of thing where they feel like, you know what, we didn't come anywhere close to our goals? And I thought, I kind of got a chuckle, and I'm sure you did as well. LJ Arnold's comments about setting them up to go to the national title next year. I think heading into the bowl game, no, that should probably not be our expectations. Kudos to him for having, those goals or whatever. But that's kind of what I'm talking about, is taking that next step, but also realizing that the way you take that step is by consciously lifting your leg and taking that step forward. And so you have to do all the little things that got you to this point and do them at a higher degree to get you up another point. And so I think that's the other thing that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think that goes back to culture. And I
Sure.
think it shows too, I think early in the season when Kansas was having success, the team didn't let it get to themselves.
Yeah.
If they did, they wouldn't have won 5 straight to start the year. And so I think there's confidence there that, hey, these guys can reset and have a bigger goal. Because guess what? I'm sure they don't want to be playing in the Liberty Bowl next year. I'm sure they like in Arizona, playing in the First Responders Bowl, whichever one Oklahoma State played in. That's like the Fiesta Bowl subsect one. Like they like to be playing in that, or hey, maybe the Alamo Bowl. Like
Yep.
there are better bowls to play in than the Liberty Bowl. And considering the fact that we'll see what the schedule looks like, I think that will determine a lot with the win total heading into the year next year. But I want to get your opinion here, Kevin.
Sure.
In terms of the win total for next year, without looking at the schedule,
Ooh.
I think we can safely assume Kansas will not play Texas and Oklahoma, probably play one of those, and probably play some of the new Big 12 teams as well. What do you think the win total should be right now without even knowing who they have home and away?
Okay. Now, to me, this is two separate questions because to me, there's what should Vegas set the win total at,
Sure.
and what do I think KU will win next year?
Mm.
And I think Vegas had probably set it at something like 6 or 6.5. I'm gonna go out there and think that, with returning 10 of 11 starters, arguably even upgrading, at that one spot where you don't return somebody. And Earl Bostic had a really nice season, I think it's important to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Defensively, you've got to improve. Special teams, and by that I don't mean like you have to. I mean, you would think that, with the guys returning, with the guys they're adding, they would be better than, I know KU was, I think, 107th nationally in SP plus heading into the Arkansas Bowl game. And obviously the Arkansas Bowl game did not go super well for the defense. So I would expect that they probably dropped there. The other thing is, and maybe I'm jinxing it, and you know that I got called out for jinxing when they were 5-0. So I do have wood in front of me. I'm going to knock on that wood right now. Special teams, they can't be as bad as they were this year. They just made so many mistakes on that end. They didn't have, obviously, the accurate kicking, but even beyond that, the return mistakes and different things like that. I think they're going to be quite a bit better on special teams. And I thought one of the positives in the transfer portal was them going out and getting 2 kickers, one of whom is a proven FBS kicker. And so you're looking at potentially getting better there. I think the coaches have a pretty good idea that they can make major gains on special teams and will make major gains on special teams. And so I look at this team as an 8-win team next year. And I think that they can go above that depending on how much they clean up, some of these different things. I think they maybe could have gotten to 8 this year had Jalen stayed healthy all year. And so I don't see that as a huge, huge jump. But at the same time, I do expect them to be better next year. It's hard to tell without seeing the schedule and knowing all that stuff. But right now, I would say that eight seems like a solid, a pretty solid goal. What do you think?
8? It's a lot. It's a lot of wins. I think the non-con schedule helps, right? You're expecting
Sure.
probably 2-1. Illinois is going to be good next year. They looked good against Mississippi State, so that'd be a fun game. But I think probably 2-1 there, and I think Vegas will probably put it about 5.5.
Yeah.
I think that's probably where it'll lie, maybe 6-ish. I just, I
So
think
we're on the same page from the Vegas lines.
Yeah, I think so. I think KU next year goes 7-5. I think that's
Yeah.
where I'm at. I think that. Yeah, I don't know. We got to see how this all. That was also my story I meant to mention. Like, how does this roster look at the start of spring practice? Who are they able to get in the next 11 days before the portal window closes? Who can they keep, right? Does any big player declare for the NFL draft? Does anyone decide to leave? Mike Nowitzki, is he back? Lonnie Phelps, all these guys, like, are the KU has players now that you're like, man, they can't lose this guy to the portal. It's great that Jalen Daniels is going to be back, and I think it's going to be great that you're going to have Devin Neal, Daniel Highshaw, a lot of the offensive line. But again, like, you're still worrying. These guys are home,
For sure.
and when they're home, family can talk you into stuff. Like,
Yep.
it can happen. So I think for me, that's one of my big worries, and we'll kind of see how it plays out between now and um, when the window closes and spring practice starts. This is why I love football so much, because it really has become a 12-month a year sport, really outside of February. And
Yeah.
guess what? I will soak up the non-football February and do a lot of basketball stuff. Because then when we get into March, it's spring practice and March Madness, and it's just a lot of chaos and a lot of fun. So I can't complain. But all right, Kevin, any final thoughts you have before we get out of here?
No, I think, this year, since we've been looking back at it, I think obviously was a special year for a lot of reasons. And you don't just break the bowl streak. You don't just, break different streaks that you wish weren't there in the first place. But, to get College Game Day on campus, to get the Liberty Bowl, and have, we talked before the bowl about how those bowl games can be, a 4-hour long commercial for for your university. In Kansas' case, that commercial went to 3 overtimes,
And
and I
had
think,
3.9 million people watching.
and
3.9
so
million.
and so you look at a lot of that. I think, if Kansas had won that game, I think a lot of people would have been tempted to rank the Jayhawks. I think that with KU losing that game, even in triple overtime, there's maybe going to be a little bit more reticence there. And I think, too, a lot's going to depend on what you were talking about with Mike Nowitzki's decision, with some of these guys who have the COVID years and things like that. But at the same time, I think, while I do think next year's team is going to be better, and I think that it's going to sort of be the next step with a lot of these same guys returning, I don't think we should forget what they did this year, and sort of how special that was from a lot of different reasons, a lot of different things. 3 straight sellouts. When you look at the way attendance was at certain points in the last 5 years, uh, and then, the things that are coming along with that, locking down your coach to a longer term contract, the stadium improvements that are going to come. It was a really strong, I guess you would technically say last year was a first step, but this was, sort of the big first step. And I think that when we look back 5 years from now, whether Lance Leipold's still the coach at Kansas or not, I think that we'll be able to look back at this year as a driving force of a lot of positive things that will happen in the Kansas program.
Yeah, I think it's the year that probably reawakens the Kansas football fan base. And Kevin, I'll tell you what, it's been really fun to cover this with you and
Sure.
do these podcasts. It was funny being in Memphis and having a lot of people say that this is how they've found us, is on YouTube, watching the videos and everything. So also, thanks for everyone that said hi. That was cool. And thanks for everyone for watching all throughout the year. We'll have some more stuff over the off season. Obviously, our kind of post-game videos will keep going. I'm sure we'll do some more videos with football stuff going on in January, and recruiting and all the craziness that's going to be in the next 11 days. And of course, if you're not a VIP member at fog.net, make sure you do check that out. We do post a lot of stuff on the recruiting side, team intel, what we're thinking, what might happen, who could stay, who could go, all that type of stuff. We've got you covered there on the VIP board. But Kevin, thank you as always for joining us for the podcast today. And everyone, we will talk to you all again soon.